Okay, good. I want to record this and put it up online. Welcome, all of you that aren't seeing this live. You see it recorded. One of the things I said is that the test is going to be 75 minutes, even though it says 60, it's 75. I'm going to give you another 15 minutes to take the test because I think you're going to need it with all the questions there and the 2 essay questions. You'll have 5 essay questions, but you only have to take 2 of them. So just choose the 2 that you know the best and answer those. So 75 minutes. The test will be, I can't remember if it's open the whole week, but if not, it will be open Thursday through Saturday. I don't think anybody's going to take it Monday or Tuesday. I think you'll wait till at least the end of the week or the weekend. And so I'll open it on Thursday. So those of you that want to take it at the end of the week can, and then those of you that wait and because of work or whatever other reasons you can't take it till the weekend, it'll be open. Make sure you give yourself an hour and 15 minutes to do the test, because if you don't, then it automatically shuts down and you just get what you got. You only have one chance, and don't close it down and go somewhere, and make sure you have enough time to complete it, the 75 minutes to complete the test, because you only get one shot at taking it. Any problems at all, email me and we'll try to work something out. Study guide I put up on the announcement section. It's kind of takes a long page there on Blackboard, but the study guide really needs to be studied. I can't emphasize you enough to know those, get those terms, look them up. The test is not an easy test. It's you really test whether you've been reading, whether you've been listening, looking at the PowerPoints, those kinds of things. I think the 6 PowerPoints I've sent out, I'll send the 2 out right after the Zoom session today, and we'll go over those PowerPoints, chapter 7 and chapter 8. So if you have any other questions, email me and I'll do my best to answer them. As far as the test, the grading is concerned, all the grades should be in up until this week. I'm sorry, up until the 2nd week. The 3rd week was just finished last night at 12. So I'll get on those right away, and I'll try to get you the grades back. Everybody seems to be doing pretty good on the grades, except some people, it seems like, still don't realize you got to do, in the discussion, you got to do a discussion question, comment, and then you have to do 2 interactions with other students. By that I mean, read what other students have read and then say, oh, I can say something on this one, and just say maybe 3 sentences or 4 sentences, something like that, just 2 or 3, 4 sentences, and comment on those. Those are pretty straightforward as long as you're interacting with other students. Some people still are forgetting to, and so I give 10 points because the first comment is usually a little better thought through because you're making it and it's a little longer. The other 2 are shorter and shorter interactions, and those are only 5 points each, so it's 20 points. So it ends up adding up if you do those every week. So make sure you do everybody's been pretty good about doing the initial comment and discussion board, but not necessarily the 2nd or 3rd. I noticed a couple of you still haven't gotten your diary essay in, and I just can't encourage you enough to do that. Even if it's late, you'll get some credit. I'll go ahead and take it. I'm saying that right now for you that didn't get it in. And if you're behind at all, just email me and we'll work something out. I really want to work with those of you that are here. So if you have any questions, and sometimes you can show up here and talk to me, and if you don't feel comfortable talking on Zoom, then just email me and we'll work it out. All right, so let's look at the lecture 7 and lecture 8. So let me get those up here. Give me a second. Okay, lecture 7. Share screen. Okay. Can you see that? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, good. Maybe, is that, whoa, what happened there? Okay. Is that a little better, a little bigger? I hope so.
Yes.
All right. So, um, see if I can figure out. I can't move it. Okay, so in this part, we're looking at movies. The interesting thing about movies, movies came before television. A lot of times we think that movie, and not everybody thinks this, but some people think that movies came after television because it seems like a little more less popular and a little more sophisticated in some ways, but it's really not. Television came after movies. Movies, of course, were shown in movie theaters as they are today, only they were a little different. So we're going to talk just a little bit about the development of movies. And of course, to do that, you have to talk about the development of images. Now, what does movies do? What are the impacts of movies? And just really clearly, it brings people together. It evokes, they evoke and symbolize universal themes and universal experiences. Why? Because movies are a way of telling stories. And we've already talked about how important stories are. At any rate, and they also help us understand and respond to historical events. They encourage us to re-examine contemporary ideas of the world that evokes particular responses to race, class, spirituality, gender, etc., sexuality, etc., all those kinds of things. Now, the development of movies, believe it or not, Leonardo da Vinci theorized creating of a device that would reproduce reality. In the 17th century, they have this thing called the magic lantern, which was just a really simple kind of thing. It wasn't a movie at all, but it seemed like something would be moving. You can see a picture of one there on the PowerPoint presentation. The magic lantern sort of thing, or actually, and so then there were all these other devices that happened in the 19th century, and I won't go over them and identify all those, but you can look at those and read about them on the PowerPoint. But those were the real work for movies began with the kinetograph, early movie cinema developed by Thomas Edison. Now, it's interesting. What else did Thomas Edison do? You've heard about Thomas Edison, right? The inventor of the light bulb, and he had a lot to do with sound, but now you're seeing he has to do with images at all, as well. And he developed this in 1890s. Really brilliant guy, Edison. And then the kinescope. So the kinetograph was first, and the kinescope was an early projected system that served as a kind of peep show. And you kind of see a picture of one. There's this little hole you look in this big device, and the film projecting system that served as a kind of peep show for which viewers could look through a hole and saw images moving on a tiny plate. And so those were the first things. Of course, celluloid, you all know what that is, because that's what film used to be before it was digitalized. And that's that transparent, pliable film that can hold a coating of chemicals sensitive to light. And other such developments like that, the vitascope by Thomas Edison, many of the different things were involved in the development of film. Now, film started out, when it started out, of course, there wasn't any sound. You had the films developed first by the Nickelodeons. Now, what's a Nickelodeon? It's the first makeshift movie theater, which was often converted from other kinds of stores and other kinds of buildings. And you get, if you look at the PowerPoint, you can see pictures here of just these old buildings. It could have been an old pawn shop or restaurant or something like that. And they had, it was almost like a little mini theater. And they showed these films on there. And the films, though, were accompanied by music. people playing music, either the organ or the piano or maybe some other kinds of orchestra kinds of things. So you had those things. And the Nickelodeon showed silent films. So the films themselves were silent, but people would have would play music along with them. Typically, they, of course, when you have silent film, you have to, once in a while you'd have a word that would come up, but most of the time you would have to be very dramatic and play out this story in a much more exaggerated behaviors. And so those were the first actors and actresses came from these Nickelodeon areas. And they flourished during the great European immigration. That was the dawn of the 20th century. Eventually they gave way to larger and more lavish movie theaters. So this was the silent era. And of course we have people like Buster Keaton and who's this other guy? Anybody know who this guy is? Charlie Chaplin, do you know him? Have you heard him? Wonderful. If you get a chance, go look at some of these. They're on, you can go to YouTube and find little clips of both Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin, and they're just great. Chaplin was amazing. And they were during the silent era. The silent era existed from 1890s to the late 1920s. The early motion pictures were considered lost because the nitrate film used in that area was extremely unstable and flammable, and so it just degenerated. Some of the great silent eras were Buster Keaton and I said that, and Chaplin, so you got that. Okay, so one of the things that should be really important and you should think about when you think about films is the narrative style. Films, as I said earlier, were a form of storytelling. They still are. You get to use images, much like some books have images in there plus words. Film has images plus spoken words, and they tell a story. And eventually, not every film at first told a story, but eventually most films learn to tell a story with dramatic action, with conflict. Every good story has some dramatic action and some conflict, mainly from their individual characters. So let's look at narrative just for a minute, and I won't go into this a whole lot, but narratives are everywhere. Narratives appear throughout the media and society, in novels, plays, comic books, television shows, and even in commercials. Commercials are very brief, condensed narratives, but they're there. Oh, I have a problem. Nobody likes me. What do? I get this toothpaste. It makes my teeth clean, gives me good breath, and now people like me and I can sell my product. I mean, that's a narrative. It's a very simple kind of narrative, but nevertheless, they're there. If you want to sell a car, you tell a narrative, how all the other cars aren't as good as your car because, and you say why, and there's the conflict. So narratives are the most common in fiction, but they also appear in many kinds. Documentaries, animated films, experimental avant-garde films, short films. Narratives are really everywhere. They set up and they have exposition. There's the rising action. They move into making it more, so this tension builds within the film, within the protagonist. And the antagonist begins to mount. Many events will happen and the stakes get higher, and then that brings you to the climax of the film, just like Indiana Jones or one of those other films. Maybe you're not familiar with that, but many of the films, almost all films, have that sort of climax. And at the climax, then there's a turning point which marks a change for the better, for worse in the protagonist. And then the falling action, which is usually a lot shorter, and that's sort of the aftermath of what happens. You can see this in all good stories. You look at the stories like if you read, do either one of you read any of Tolkien's work, The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit or anything like that? Have you read those? No? Okay. How about Harry Potter? Do you read those? Or have you heard of them or seen the movies? Okay, you've seen the movies. So Harry Potter has that. He starts out, you introduce the characters. They're all kind of, fun, and you kind of learn to like them. And then there's a problem. Something happens in one of the Harry Potter movies. And then Harry's got to figure it out, and the kids have to figure it out. And they have to overcome this powerful thing. And they usually use their magic power to help them do that. At any rate, that's the sort of climax that happens. And then once it's resolved, the film doesn't end immediately, but soon after. Conflict is really important. Conflict sometimes is man against man against nature, man against himself. Inner conflict happens. Man against society, man against machines, man against the supernatural, which happens a lot in the Harry Potter, although sometimes it's man against man or nature. Think of movies that fulfill these conflicts, and I'm sure you could think of them if you watch movies at all and if you thought long enough. So films can compare to a written text like a book or a magazine story or something like that. They have the plot, which is the basic line of the story. They have characters, which develop, and they have a setting. Okay, where is it setting? Hogwarts or wherever it is if you're dealing with Harry Potter. They have a point of view. You hear the story from somebody's perspective. And then you have major themes that come out of those. So those are just examples of stories. You find them in all good films, and that's why I'm doing it. Let's just look at an example of one, The Empire Strikes Back. Have either one of you heard of this, read it, or saw it on a movie?
I'm a huge Star Wars fan.
Oh, you are? Okay, great. So this is good. The Empire Strikes Back is an example of this. The protagonist of the very first one is Luke Skywalker, of course, and he's the hero too, and he's hiding from the Empire. The story changes as a result of the different kinds of conflict and the character's choice that force him into cinematic showdown with the antagonist. And of course, you know who the antagonist is. It's Darth Vader. And in the first one, Darth Vader almost like wins and Luke is defeated. But he's changed and becomes wiser and more humble. And eventually he comes back and Darth Vader is defeated in one of the other episodes, one of the other films. But that's how that basic storyline goes. Now, let's get back to looking at development of films. We looked at kind of how films are developed literally by literature, but now we want to look at the rise of sound. So the first films, as I said, were silent films, but then eventually they figured out a way to have sound within the film. In 1927 saw the introduction of sound. Warner Brothers did The Jazz Singer, a feature-length silent film interspersed with musical numbers and brief, at that time it was brief dialogue. Al Jolson was a charismatic and popular vaudeville singer. What's interesting, and I said this, but just to remind you, vaudeville was the early day theater. It was kind of like theater. It was a place where all different kinds of, so it wasn't just like one big long play, like a Shakespeare play, like King Lear or something. It was a potpourri, a whole lot of different kinds of entertainment. You might have a comedian, you might have a singer or a musician, then you might have a short skit of a short story that is very dramatic, and they overacted in many ways. And that was vaudeville. It was just a whole variety of, and that's where people that kind of honed their skills. It was populated by a lot of the people that couldn't attend a proper theater with Shakespeare and all that because those are so expensive. But vaudevilles were very inexpensive. A lot of they were also popular because the acting was very dramatic and obvious, and so you didn't have to be know the language really well. So a lot of immigrants came over and they got into vaudeville, or they were part of the audience of vaudeville because they could understand it and they could appreciate it. And so vaudeville, so when the movies really started and you needed actors, where did they come from? The high theater? No, high theater thought they were too good for the movie theater, which they saw as a lower class kind of thing. And so the actors and actresses came from vaudeville. And that's, of course, where Al Jolson.
Who's on first?
Yes, yes. um, and they, yes. Okay, and so in 1928, we got The Singing Fool that starred Jolson again, and that became a breakthrough talkie. Once the talkies were really seen as something that could happen, uh, it didn't take long before all the theaters eventually became much more serious and developed. Uh, in the United States, there were 60 million a week in 1927. By 90 million a week in just 2 years later. And that's how much sound pushed the annual movie audience of how many people were going there. By 1931, nearly 85% of all Americans, 20,000 theaters accommodated talkies. So there was these other film theaters that people were going to was silent. And then when talkies came in, it really changed very quickly from 28 to 31. It just really moved. Talkies also had, in all theaters in that day, had what they called newsreel. Remember, this is before television. The only place people were really getting news is, well, there's a couple places, the radio and then on newspapers. But people wanted to see the visuals, and in both of those, you couldn't really see moving visuals. So a lot of the theaters, now you go to the theater today and you just watch the one main movie, and it's maybe 2 hours long or more or less, but around that period of time. But in those days, you go to the movie theater and first you'd see a newsreel and you see what's happening around, and it'd only be 10 minutes or so, but it'd be real short, but you'd see moving news pictures. And you might actually, and I don't have this up here on the PowerPoint, but you might also see a cartoon or two, which was kind of fun. Then you saw the main feature, and then that was whatever it was.
Like in Who Framed Roger Rabbit when they're at the theater.
Absolutely. I'm glad you pointed that out, because that's one of the Roger Rabbit really has got that idea from the early motion pictures. And you can see there's different kinds of genres and documentaries and cinema verite, which is a French term for truth cinema. It's kind of a documentary style that records fragments of everyday life unobtrusively. So it's not like all set up. It looks at it in a way that looks more real, like a documentary or a news reel. Usually it's rough and grainy and shaky, and it's handheld cameras and all that kind of stuff. And then we have indies, independent music and film production houses. And so we have all these different kinds of film today that are available. Hollywood's golden age was a time when they really learned about storytelling, and they had developed film had developed into a profitable business. Went through that entrepreneurial stage, and new narrative techniques were used in the silent era, which is varied camera distance, close-up shots. None of those were you just get one camera, set it up, and then eventually they got multiple cameras and they got close-ups, far away. They would do all those kinds of, all that had to be developed. Fast-paced editing. So editing, there was these long shots, but then they started editing these films. And so the editing, some of them was really quick and really fast from different areas. And that gave a different feel to the film and more exciting in some ways. And then symbolic imagery came in. The sound movies with new genres were introduced during the golden age. Other movie making models came into being. Such as the global cinema, where cinema now, you didn't just make movies for your area or your city or your country, you made them for other countries too to see. And documentaries and films, we talked about that already. So here are just a list of the film genres. One big one that young people seem to like, and some older people too, is the horror. Science fiction's been around. Animation is still great. Crime is big now, as you can well imagine, and fantasy and suspense, document, all these different kinds. Westerns have kind of fallen off. They're not that as interesting anymore. Adventure sure are big. Anybody see the Black Widow that just come out? Talk about adventure and action film. No? Okay. Crime is a there's all these subgenres, so crime subgenres. So you have gangster films, detective. So one genre is crime. Subgenres off of crime are suspense film, thrillers, courtroom dramas, mysteries, film noir, detective films, gangster films, all that kind of stuff. So you have these subgenres. The evolution of Hollywood studio system. Studio system was the production, distribution, and exhibition of film, the three pillars, that so they say, of developing film. And it used to be that the same people that produced the films also distributed the films and also exhibited the films. In other words, they owned the production studio, they owned the distribution studio, and they owned the theaters. Well, the problem is that independent theaters couldn't come in. And so that system was eventually broken up. And the studio system created their own talent and firmly controlled by certain powerful studios. So, and this whole idea of the raising of the star system, they would promote one or two people and make them stars. And it wasn't fair to other actors, and it wasn't fair to the theaters that wanted to show it that didn't have a production studio. And so eventually we saw that the industry was controlled during that time by just a few film firms. Block booking, I just wanted to mention that. It was a time when they said theaters who wanted to play big name movies were required to also play the studio's no name. So they wouldn't. So if you're a theater operator, which we still have theaters, and you want to buy some rent or buy some films so that you can show them at your theater, the big producers would say, yeah, you can have this great film, but you got to take these other couple of films too that aren't that great. And so you couldn't really pick and choose of whatever you wanted. You had to take what they wanted and pay for the others as well. And that's what's called block booking, and it's no longer done, but it was for a while. Okay, so we already talked about this block booking, vertical integration, and all that kind of stuff. The Paramount decision happened in 1948. Supreme Court decided to end the vertical integration. Remember that vertical integration was the people that own the production companies, the people that distribute the films, and the people own the theaters. So you couldn't do all three of those. You could own a company, but you can't own all the theaters. And end that vertical integration of the film industry and force the studios to divest. Divest means get rid of themselves of the theaters. So then theaters became independent at that time, and that was a government decision that they called it a monopoly, and they got rid of that. The Hollywood 10 is a real big sort of thing that happened when 10 screenwriters and one film director were thought to be communist in the House of Un-American Activity Committee, HUAC, who had sent to prison in the late 40s for refusing to discuss their membership identifying with the Communist Party. So they felt that Hollywood had these people that really didn't get along with the U.S. democracy because they were part of the communist system, and they they took them to court and they arrested some of them. So you just need to be aware of that. That was not people should be able to be whatever they want, and they shouldn't have to be accused of that. And that has stopped now. We don't do that anymore. So the talkies of sound, the newsreel genres, these are just terms that you need to know. I'm not going to go over them. I just want you to be familiar with them. Look at the definitions I have here. Look them up in your book and find those definitions. Here's some more movie palaces. What is a movie palace? do you know, are there any movie palaces around here? Another good question. And there's one kind of, it used to be a movie palace. It's not so much anymore. It's in Portsmouth, and it's, gosh, what's the name of it? I'm forgetting it. But there's a big cinema in Portsmouth on High Street that is just, it's old now, but it's real lavish. You can tell in its day it was great. And they made it just really comfortable chairs, really nice building with a really interesting decor on the sides and all that sort of thing. So those are the movie palaces, and they emerged in the early 20th century, the 1910s in the United States, and they were like full-time single screen, created to attract the upper middle class movie theaters. We don't really have those movie palaces anymore, do we? There might be a few that are still running, but people don't make those anymore. What we've moved to is the multiplex or the megaplex theaters. Now, those are more contemporary, and those are ones if you go to Lynn Haven Mall, what do you find? One big building with one great theater? No, you find like, I don't know, 8, 10, 12 different smaller theaters, all in one big multiplex. Contemporary movie theaters that exhibit many movies at the same time in multiple screens. And that's what you find at Lynn Haven, or you can go to Pembroke and find the same thing. Megaplex theaters are when they have 14 or more screens, upscale concession stands, and some of them have IMAX screens, which is a better quality screen. Stadium seating, stadium seating means it's not just flat, but it's goes downhill so that you can all get better views. And digital projection and sound. Digital projection because we moved from film to digital. We moved from celluloid to a digital. And celluloid actually had the picture on the celluloid, on the film. Digital takes those images and puts them into electronic pulses and then brings them back together, and it's a more accurate in many ways way of seeing it. And here's production of digital format is replaced celluloid film, revolutionizing filmmaking because the cameras are more portable and production costs are much less expensive because you don't have to work with all that film. Digital video is electronically represented on the moving images, the video, in a form of encoded digital data. So what I was trying to say a minute ago, it's much clearer here, and you can see that encoded digital data. We still have, in terms of production, just a few companies that are very large. And boy, I realize I'm going on quite long here, so I better get through this. But you see Warner Brothers, Paramount, 20th Century Fox. These are all ones you'll recognize. Universal, Sony, and Disney. Now, what's interesting about these, and by the way, some are buying up others. Warner Brothers, for instance, owns Castle Rock and HBO. Walt Disney owns Marvel. Have you ever heard of Marvel? Yeah, it made comic books at first, and then the comic books turned into films. And Miramax and Pixar, all those are owned now by Walt Disney. So what's happening is there's companies that are eating up the smaller companies and getting bigger companies, but there's 6 of them right now, and they're very, very powerful. The interesting thing about the 6 is that's not the only thing they do. As we all know, Disneyland owns what besides movie production houses? What else does Disney have?
Theme parks.
I'm sorry?
Theme parks?
Imparts?
Theme parks.
Theme parks, absolutely right. So Disney has theme parks, it has movies, it also, some of them get into other kinds of media. And so what's interesting is to look at them. It's always changing, but it's looking at what these other companies own. And they own more than just film production or movie production studios. They own all other kinds of things, particularly media, but others as well. How are movies sold? Well, the big six account for 80% of the revenue that is generated. Box office sales, and then also DVD, that's really not as great as it used to be, but video sales are going way up, sales and rentals. So, and then we see global sales. So a lot of times you'll find movies that just make their money back, because movies are very expensive now to make. You'll see they make their money back from sales in the United States if you're one of the big six, but then you go overseas and you make all that, you've already paid for the film, so now you just really make a lot of the money that way. Source of movie income and expense in distribution. So we see cable outward, we see foreign distribution, we see independent film distribution, we see licensing and product placement. Now you're going to go, what? Actually, that's one of the places where you make the most money. Now, you like, Shelby, you were saying you like Star Wars. I like them too. And George Lucas actually grew up in a town. He's, I think, 1 or 2 years older than me. But he grew up in a town only about 15 or 16 miles to where I grew up, in Turlock. I used to go play football and wrestle and track and stuff like that against Modesto, where he grew up. And one of his first films was not a Star Wars film, but was, gosh, what was it called?
TX or THX, something, a few
Yeah,
numbers.
that was his very first film. But his very first commercial film that made money was one, gosh, what's the name of it? Anyway, it was about cruising small towns in California, and I know all about that because that happened in Turlock too. And I'd even go over to Modesto and do that sometimes. Gosh, I gotta think of the name of that. If I do, I'll mention it next time. Gosh, at any rate, that was his first film. But what he did when he made the first Star Wars film, because licensing these products were not that important. So he retained, when he sold his film, and
American Graffiti.
That's it, American Graffiti. Got it. That's it. It's a great film. It's kind of old, but anyway, I loved it because it was happened in Modesto, which is real close to Turlock, where I grew up. So he retained all the extra, like the Star Wars dolls and the Star Wars plastic things you play with, and the books and comic book. I mean, all that other clothing, T-shirts. He kept that, and that was one of the smartest things he ever did, because that's where a lot of the money is made now. In fact, a lot of films, particularly those kinds of films, that's where most money is made. When you have these series films like Harry Potter or Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or something like that, we have several films on the same theme. You usually have a lot of products. Games come out, video games, board games, all that kind of stuff is sold. And if you can make money on all that stuff, you end up making sometimes more money on that than you do on anything. And but he was smart enough to figure that out really early on, and so that's why he got so wealthy. And of course, he, not only he had a lot of talent, and he was a good director and that sort of stuff too. So we have all these different ways of getting income. So I need to move on. Here are some more terms you need to be familiar with, and just say consensus narratives. Does anybody know who this is?
Isn't that Spielberg?
That's Steven Spielberg. That's right, an older Spielberg, but he's the one that made Jaws and E.T. and all those kinds of things. And he and Lucas did a lot of working together as well. He's probably a little better director than Lucas, and Lucas is better on some of the other parts of movies, production, and the technology, which he has what is it? Industrial Magic Lot. I can't remember, but he has his own company just to do that kind of technology stuff with movies. Okay, enough of movies and movie production. I want to go now, see if I can do this. There, I want to go. Can you still see? I'm still sharing it so you can see this. Can you see what the next thing is? Television? Can you see
Yes.
that? Yes?
Mhm.
Okay, good. All right, so television, just like I said last time, one thing remains constant through movies, film, books, radio, television, stories. Stories are important. Stories are how we communicate. Now, sometimes the stories are really short, 10, 15 sentences, but story is a story. And sometimes stories can be told just by visuals. And sometimes it's visuals and film. So the early television in 1948, 1% of America's household had television. By 1953, so how many years is that difference? 48 to 53.
5.
5? Okay, you're right. In 5 years, it went from 1% to 50%. In other words, one home in every 100 had a television. 5 years later, 50%. Wouldn't you really like to have a little bit of money invested in making television? Because that's how people got rich really fast. By the 60s, the number had gone, so that's another 7 years, they had gone to 90%. And most homes all have televisions in them now. Not all, mine doesn't, but most homes do. Okay, so that was 48. But the fact is that television was invented long before then. And Nipkow, you need to know him. He made a scanning device, a large flat metal disc, perforated with small holes. And so he had these little holes in it, and he was the first that holes organized in a spiral pattern, and it separated the picture into pinpoints of light that could be transmitted by a series of electronic lines. Two other key people is Zorinskin and then Farnsworth, right here, Farnsworth and Zorinskin. And I'll let you read that, but they both, one invented the iconoscope, which is the first TV camera tube, very important development, converted light rays into electronic symbols. And that had to happen before television could really take place. Farnsworth transmitted the first electronic TV picture by rotating straight lines stretched on a square of painted glass by 90 degrees. And he also conducted the first demonstration, so this is him, of television. So these are two really important, hint, two really important people that you probably need to be aware of in the development of television. Now, I'm not going to go too much into that, except that by 1941, the FCC adopted an analogical standard, 545 lines. That means lines across the screen for all US TV sets. And by that, when we say all, you only had black and white at that time. You didn't have color. So color was yet to be developed. And analog is this old system. And now we have digital, which is multicast symbol. So now you have many opportunity for many more channels, because on the digital, you can embed and unpack within there many multiple compressed digital channels. Here it was just single. So in the early days of television, you only had a few channels. You couldn't have many more, because why? Remember, we said this before with radio and sound and that sort of stuff, is that you only had the airways only have certain number of signals that can come out. So what happens with any one of these signals, the digital can compress it into one, and so into one many then. But here only one would come. So that's just a development and advancement. TV became a mass medium Okay, so it was in NBC began regular telecasts in 1939. Remember, but in 1941 there was only oh no, yeah, 1948 there was only one out of every 100 homes that have it. So even though it began in 39, why didn't television take off? But if it began in 39, why did it have to wait till 48 to really take off? Do you know?
For people to afford them.
Well, okay, that was part of it, sure. But the real reason was what was happening worldwide in 1939.
World War II.
That's exactly right. And all the people that were working in electronics and all that had to put their skills to work on winning the war. I mean, literally, our nation and other nations were at risk. And also all the technology and all the equipment and all the resources. So you couldn't really even build these television sets at that point because all those resources were going to make war equipment and war technology. And so that's why it was invented almost 10 years before it really began to take off. And so it just kind of went on hold for about 8 years. Now, we didn't enter the war till the 40s, but by 39, Europe was at war. And we saw the clouds gathering. And so we started to build up our war effort. Okay, so all right, let's move on. There. So the golden age of television really was in the 50s, the late 40s, 50s, and 60s. This is something Buffalo Bob with Howdy Doody and Clown. In 1947, the Markets debuted with two milestone programs, both broadcast by NBC. Howdy Doody captivated a generation of young viewers. I remember that. It was still going when I was a kid, many years later, I would say. And then Meet the Press, which was a very strong news program that I think is still being broadcast today in a sort of different name. It was black and white then, now it's colored and all that. Both NBC and CBS unveiled 15-minute national newscasts. So remember, when television started, it didn't have news. It was only later on. And they would have, I guess the morning news and the evening news, and then late evening news eventually happened. John Cameron Swayze is the host of the NBC Camel News. That's interesting. Camel News. What do they mean by Camel News? Do you know? Well, a couple of things that this is important. Why I mentioned Camel News. Camel was the name of a cigarette. And in those days, they didn't know that cigarettes were so dangerous and unhealthy for you. So they would advertise them on television. It's not, you can't do that anymore, but in those days you could. And in fact, how shows were paid for in the early days, which you would have advertising, you wouldn't have 30 seconds or 45 or a minute advertising. You would have a show, the whole show was sponsored by one advertiser. And so when this 15-minute show, the news came up, it was the Camel News, meaning that Camel Cigarettes was paying for the whole news show. Sponsored by Camel Cigarettes. Meanwhile, CBS had the CBS News with Douglas Edwards, and they had somebody supporting that. But early days of television shows, when it first started out, they had to support it because it's very costly to make a show. So how did they do it? They had a one advertiser sponsor the whole show. Now we don't do that, do we? Not very often, if we do it at all. Now we sell advertising time, and we sell it to various advertisers. So you could be having toothpaste advertising right next to selling a car or finding a lawyer or whatever it is you want. Okay. Why is this not moving? There we go. Okay, the birth of the golden age. Texaco, notice that. What's Texaco? That's a gas station, right? It's an oil company. Texaco Star Theater. with Milton Berle. And this is Milton Berle. I don't remember him very well, but he was real popular. But that's, again, that whole Texaco Star Theater with Milton Berle, this guy. And this kind of took over. This is like the television version of vaudeville. They had all different kinds of acts coming on, usually musical, but sometimes stand-up comedy, or sometimes other kinds of things that were entertaining. And then they had the Toast of the Town with Ed Sullivan, this guy, and he introduced these guys. Do you know who those guys were? The Beatles. You probably don't remember them. 1964, the Beatles were on the Ed Sullivan Show. They came over from Europe, from UK to the United States for the first time, and were on the Ed Sullivan Show. And then the rest is history. They were known. The birth and golden age of the networks. The Fairness Doctrine is introduced by the FCC in 1949. It required broadcasters to develop equal time for controversial issues of public importance and give those with opposing views time to air them. Now, the FCC really doesn't do that much anymore, but in the early days, if you had something on, you had to give free time at some other time during the day for somebody else to give the opposite view. The Sears and Roebuck catalog was first offered on television. Yeah, I'm sure that was a big one. Now, television very quickly found its way into all American homes, as you saw from 1948 to 1960. It was in 90% of the American homes, and it had a really big influence in shaping politics. Now, politics was shaped at first by how big your voice could be and how far you could ride on a train to go to different cities and to speak and try to get people to vote for you. And then when radio came, you had the fireside chats, and you didn't have to have this big booming voice. You could have a very comfortable, rational, sensible, reasoned, logical voice. But what happened when television came, as opposed to radio, is that you could see people. Now, do you see these two images over here? Do you see them? Do you know who this guy is? He's a guy named called Richard Nixon. At that time, he was vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower. Do you know who this guy is?
John F. Kennedy.
Absolutely right. Now, do you notice the difference between them? One's wiping his nose. One was sweating a lot. One needed a shave. One was wearing this kind of gray suit that didn't really make him look that good. This guy looked better on TV. And it's really interesting. They did a study in the 1960 when during that, this is a presidential debate. In 1960 was the first time they had presidential debates. And Nixon was supposed to win because he was for 8 years the vice president. He had a lot more knowledge about politics, it was thought, than Kennedy, and maybe he really did. Kennedy was a newcomer. He was younger. He was an upstart. He really wasn't ready to be a president yet because he was so young. But what happened is Kennedy went on television with Nixon, and Nixon had been really busy that day. He wasn't feeling that good. He forgot that he didn't shave. He shaved in the morning, but he had a really thick beard that by the time the evening came, it showed up. And Kennedy wore, you can't see it here, was a darker suit, a blue suit, and he wore kind of a gray suit that washed his face out and his complexion. And you saw him sweat a lot. And he just didn't look that good on television. Where Kennedy was used to television, he was the son of a real rich person, and so he was used to being in the public eye. And he was just very calm and very careful and very articulate. And people that watched the debate thought Kennedy won. People that couldn't see the debate for some reason, they were in their car, or they were at home and they didn't have a TV or whatever. They listened to the debate. They thought Nixon won. Now, the reason they thought Nixon won was Nixon was you know, was a vice president and had knowledge, but Kennedy looked so much better. Who won the election?
Kennedy.
Kennedy won the election. Yeah. And that changed politics. From now on, it wasn't this big booming voice. It wasn't, you had to be really, now when you run for an office and you have a debate, they argue over background, over what you can wear, over where you can stand. Can you stand on, can you use a stool to stand on if you're shorter? All those things are decided. Where the podium's going to be, can you have a podium, where, how often you can, all that stuff is done, because now they know that the visual is so important. We are a visual culture, and in part, television has made us a visual culture. And it even goes to politics. So no one can really be president anymore without doing well visually on the camera. And that's really played out in many ways, even if the camera is only for social media. And social media has changed a lot too. Okay, but we're not doing social media, we're doing television. I Love Lucy is very important. You can read a little bit about her. Suddenly, everybody loved Lucy in 1951. This is important because women were not very strong in television until Lucy came along, and it was a comedy, and she was the lead. She was really talented woman. And I Love Lucy breaks television ground on several levels. She produced the film or the television instead of being broadcast live. Now, up until then, everything was broadcast live. But instead of being broadcast live, she broadcast it earlier and then could edit it a little bit. The program established Lucy Ball as the television's first major female star. So she was a big deal. And she's funny. You look at her and you just think she's, anyway. But I Love Lucy was big in the early 50s. Okay, the role of television, and this is a question that we ask of all media. Does it mirror society, or does television shape our society? And of course, you know who these guys are down here, don't you? You know the program.
American Idol.
American Idol.
Yeah, American Idol.
And you know these guys up here too, right?
Star Trek: The Next Generation.
That's right. Star Trek: The Next Generation. Great stuff. And but does it shape society, or does it mirror what we already think? And that's a question. A lot of people think one, a lot of people think the other, many people think both. And that's how I sort of think you can make an argument for both. You just have to have an opinion on that. Okay, the original networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. Things have changed today. The audience of all age are moving to video streaming, so we don't watch it when it's on time. When television came out, you had to be available at that particular time that the program came out. If you had something else to do at the time, you wouldn't get to see the show, period. You couldn't tape it and save it for later. All that technology was developed later. Television brought viewers together to share major turning points. And so elections, stage turning points like that, but also things that weren't football. You can always see, even today, still, we all get together. It's almost like a major holiday to watch. Even if you don't like football, you kind of get together and watch the advertisements, or you just get together with your friends sometimes to watch these major baseball, football, the major events. Not everybody, granted, but most people do, if you can see that. Television, analog recording, prime time, CATV. We've talked about some of this stuff. CATV is community antenna television. Prime time is 7 to 11. You probably know that and what prime time is. So just look over these terms. You need them. A few other terms are affiliate stations and Kinescope. We talked about Kinescope earlier, but look back at that, really know what that is. Before the days of videotaping, a Kinescope technology was presented television broadcast by, preserving television broadcasts by using film cameras to record the TV show off of the studio monitor. So in other words, he just took a picture of the monitor It was really terrible quality, but at least you could preserve the show. Affiliate stations are radio or television stations that are roughly independently owned stations on contract to be part of a network. And those are what we have today. So remember what happened with that legal thing earlier on where we said you couldn't own all the stations. What happens is you can become a partner, you can sign a contract to be affiliated. It's not owned by, different between owned and affiliated, because if you're owned, then you control everything. If you're affiliated, you can get that programming, but if you don't like what they're doing, what NBC is doing, you can go to CBS. You can, okay, the next time contract comes up, you're going to change and go with another station. And that's what affiliate stations are. And that's what they are for the most part. The company owns a few, but most of the ABC stations, NBC stations, CBS stations, Fox stations are affiliate. Okay, so here I'm not going to go over these because we're running out of time. It's been an hour, and that's long enough. Sketch comedy, situation comedy, anthology dramas, episodic serials, chapter shows, all those different kinds of things. Television is changing. You all know about Hulu, joint owned by Disney and 20th Century Fox. What's interesting there is two really of the big six went together to own Hulu, which is interesting. Cable has changed television in profound ways. Now, when I grew up and had television, there wasn't cable. There was only off the air. Remember, air only has limited channel space. And so I only had like a dozen, if that many, stations to watch. And some of them were terrible. When cable came in, I can get really good pictures, really good sound and picture quality for like 100 or more stations. It's just incredible what you can get. So this just talks about network era influence, and you need to just look at that. Basic cable, we've already talked about that. Stations and channel, I'm going to let you look at this, the super station, the premium station, the pay-per-view, and the video on demand. You're familiar with those things pretty well. I've never found a class that students that didn't know premium channel, didn't know really all those. But look at them again, make sure you know the definitions and that sort of thing. Regulations, and so just look at these, go back and take some time to read through this. Leasing channels, electronic publishing, yeah, common carriers, all those kinds of things. I'm just going to go through this. So I'm going to just mention evergreen, TV syndicate, popular, lucrative, and enduring network runs. Any of you seen Friends? Either one of you? Yeah. I mean, Friends seems like it was such a popular show when it came out, but it's still popular today, isn't it? And why is that? Well, I don't know. Maybe it's a really good show, but also why are some really good, really high rated shows, some kind of dead within 2 or 3 years or 4 years, and others can go on for 20 years? You know, another show like that is Office. They're not making Office anymore, but people watch it. I love it. I like to watch it. And those shows that last, that have staying power, or what some people call legs, those are evergreen shows. But what happens is now you can buy an evergreen show for a lot less money because it's already been paid for. And so, and if you're a producer and you make a show that lasts for a long period of time, you really like that, because not only do you make it when it's first broadcast, you make it when it's broadcast the second time or the third time, or years later when it's still being broadcast, you can make money. And so that's what I would just recommend you look at. Syndication and shares, just begin to know, because there will be some questions on this on the test, what a share is. And a share in TV audience measurement, a statistical estimate of the percentage of homes turned on to a certain program compared with those simply using their sets at the time of the sample. So a share is of those shows. Okay, so if you take 100% of the television programs, I mean homes that have TVs, it's judged by homes. Let's say we got 100 homes that have television, and then you have you rarely have all those television homes turned on to television at the same time. But let's say you have 80 of them turned on, so 20 aren't. So out of those 80 stations, 40 might be turned into your program. Well, if you do, that's an incredible share rating. An audience measurement of statistical estimates of the percentage of homes turned on to a certain program, an audience estimate. So that means it's an estimate, not of the 100, but of the 80. So it'd be 50% of the 80 shows that are turned on. So now what are the other 40 doing? Well, they might be distributed between another 50, 60 other stations. Do you get what I'm talking about? Yes or no? You do? Okay, so let's just go over it again. There's 100 shows, but not everybody's watching. If you had 40 that was turned on to 100, that would be 40%. But then you say, okay, but not of all the shows, of those that are watching right now, that have their show, those homes that have a television turned on right now. Now, maybe instead of 80, there's only 50 that have it turned on. And remember what I said, 40 are watching it? Now what percentage do you have? You have 80% of the shows watching, and that's your share. So the share is always out of how many homes have a television turned on at a certain point, and that's what the share is. Different than a rating, by the way, and you need to kind of look at what a rating is too. Okay. Here's some other terms. I think those are a little more easy to understand. And that's it. So stop share. We're back. And that's all I have for today. If you have any questions, email me. I hope this was useful. You're going to be taking the test later this week. And yes, this will be on the test. So the test will be on the weekend sometime after you've done all your other work for the week. Then you can take the test. Test is on the first 8 chapters. Okay. Well, have a good week. Email me if you have any questions. That's all for today. Have a good one. Bye-bye. Thanks for coming.